Welcome back. We're beginning a new order of lessons dealing with praise. Today, praise with music. And every lesson this quarter is going to be dealing with praise. We're kind of instructed to praise those that we're around, to lift them up, to build them up, not falsely, but to recognize what they've done, how they've helped is a way of praising them. But when the praise that we do, when it is directed toward God, when it is directed to Him because of who He is and what He has done, we can tend to call that worship. I have been in a number of very powerful worship experiences here in the sanctuary, TCTC, Tennessee Christian Teen Convention, powerful times at Camp ACC. In Vespers, where for a long time Janie Hatfield led the praise time, and after that, Beth Crouch for some time as well, has been currently leading praise and worship during Vespers. Powerful times down around the campfire. Some years ago, Wednesday night, I taught a lesson that I called Weapons of War. Talked about different weapons, early development from a stone to a club to a spear, then moving up through the development of warfare in the Middle Ages and in times after that, and then to the more modern, from hand grenades, big bombs, and maybe even nuclear weapons. But looking at these different weapon systems, I was just struck from an example in Scripture, what may undoubtedly, in my eyes, was a more powerful weapon system. Israel was in trouble. Armies were coming against them. Well-armed armies, vastly superior numbers. What were they to do? How were they going to survive? Well, they were directed to pass down this to the plain, to where the opposing armies were. And while they went, they were not shoulder swords or slings or anything like that, but they were to be singing praise to God. Their weapon, so to speak, was praise, their reliance upon God. So you could say they had two weapons. One was obedience. They did what they were told to do. But the more important one, they recognized who God was, and they were praising Him. And God won the victory for them. The lesson writer in the commentary book reminisced about movie theaters from a long time ago. Each Saturday there would be a feature film. Then there would be an episode from a serial movie. Can you remember back that far? Each segment of the serial movie was designed to leave the hero or the heroine in a really, really bad situation, with the goal being that they would come back next Saturday to see, how the hero escaped. He said that back before World War II, an uncle come visiting and took him to the movie to see the feature film, and it was followed by the serial movie about Dick Tracy. As the episode was ending, Tracy was in a diving bell. The air hose had been cut by a villain. Seemed there was no way that Tracy could survive. Well, his uncle left in the middle of that following week. He didn't get back to the movie theater to see the sequel. He did not know how Tracy survived the situation that he was in. Now, Moses led the Israelites into a similar cliffhanger situation in Exodus chapter 14. Though freed from bondage, they found themselves trapped between the Egyptians and the Red Sea. Now, if you want to talk about that was really being caught between a rock and a hard place. The Israelites seemed doomed, except God was with them. Now, as the Israelites had been traveling away from Egypt, they were led by a pillar of cloud during the day, a pillar of fire at night. Well, when Pharaoh changed his mind again, and he sends 600 of the best chariots as well as other chariots after them, the cloud took them to the Red Sea. But then the cloud moved behind them so that as Pharaoh's army came, that they were unable to see. The lesson writer didn't know how Dick Tracy escaped, but he does know how Israel escaped. And our lesson today is about a song in that regard that teaches us important things some 35 centuries later. I want to set the lesson context, and let me tell you, I'm using a really broad brush here. Way before the Exodus, 1447 BC, God had made a promise to Abram initially. Then his name was changed to Abraham. Going to receive a promised land. Going to be the father of a vast nation. And the only problem was he and Sarah didn't have a child. Well, finally, Isaac was born. And Isaac's growing up. That's kind of a rough start, to form a nation, isn't it? And then Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac. And he moves, towards doing that, and God stopped him. Then after Isaac, 2 sons. Making progress, aren't we? Esau and Jacob. Esau was twins, although they weren't identical twins by a long ways. They had vast difference of appearance. Esau is being born first. But the next son has a hold of the heel of the child that's being born ahead of him, and that was Jacob. Of course, Jacob had a lot more sons. At a time of famine came. What were they to do? Well, they end up moving to Egypt because that's where a son of Jacob had been sold by his older brothers to be a slave there. They were slave traders, and that's where the slave traders took him. And Joseph had problems at first. It was a tough go. But later on, interpreting dreams of Pharaoh, telling him about there's going to be years of prosperity, and you better set aside during the years of prosperity because there's going to be years of want. Well, it was during this time that Joseph's family also moved to Egypt. Now, over the centuries in Egypt, the Israelites witnessed significant leadership changes. There'd be an Egyptian. Then there would be a foreign intruder. Then there'd be Egyptians again. The intruders were sometimes called haikos, sometimes translated shepherd kings, or maybe it just meant a foreign king. But kind of easy to understand the antipathy that the Egyptians came to have towards shepherds. And when we think about the emerging nation of Israel, that's pretty much what they were going to become. Then there's a new king, a new Pharaoh. Didn't remember what Joseph had done for Egypt. Measures were taken to subdue the people, to slow their population growth. And after 430 years in Egypt, God was willing to act to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, it's during this time that Moses was born. Well known that he was adopted by a princess of Egypt. And that at 40 he had to flee Egypt because he had killed an Egyptian. 40 years later, Moses hears about this interesting sight. A bush that was on fire, and it kept burning. It wasn't consumed. Well, Moses travels to see this, comes into contact with God. God tells him what he wants to do, which is lead his people out of slavery in Egypt. So God worked through Moses and Aaron, Moses' brother, to bring about 9 plagues that just devastated Egypt. And then the 10th one that took the firstborn, except the firstborn of the Israelites, because they had some blood of a lamb on the doorpost. That the oldest of that, the firstborn of that family, did not die. Well, Pharaoh expels the Israelites from Egypt. And as God's people, they were leaving Egypt. And they were reminded again of their destination, the promised land, Canaan. And then Pharaoh changes his mind one more time, and he sends, his folks after the Israelites. Now, have you ever had a plan? Maybe it was a goal that you wanted to head towards. Maybe it was a problem that you were trying to get out of, and you finally come up with a solution. You come up with a plan. You come up with a goal. And it didn't come to fruition because God's plan for you was different. And his plan was much better than what your plan would have been. So the Israelites crossed the Red Sea safely after the waters had parted. The Egyptians drowned as they tried to follow. Now, the crossing of the Red Sea is pivotal in the history of ancient Israel. The slaves were free. They're beyond the reach of Pharaoh. And Moses and his people respond by bursting forth with joyous singing. The printed text for this lesson contains the second part of that song. The song is sometimes called a song of Moses and Miriam. Sometimes it's called a song of Moses and Israel. We're just picking up with verse 11 of this song. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders. And we have 2 rhetorical questions here that both point towards the uniqueness of God. The Egyptians had hundreds and hundreds of gods and goddesses that they had, made up. Some of the plagues could have been considered to be a direct attack on some of these gods. The plague of darkness, perhaps being seen as a challenge, the sun god Ra. We do know that the plagues were judgment against the Egyptian gods, a judgment against the Egyptians, judgment against those who had been persecuting the Israelites. Well, the second question builds on the first. An emphasis on God's holiness. Starts here in the book of the book of Exodus, and continues through Revelation. because the Lord is holy. We are expected to be holy as well. Only by being unique in ways similar to God's character can his people be a blessing to the nations. Now, the final phrases of the verse declares that the Lord is to be held in reverence for his praiseworthy deeds, for the wonders that he has done. And I'm reminded of a song that we sometimes use on Sunday mornings here at West Hills, God of wonders beyond the galaxy, you are holy. You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. Well, the right hand of God often is a reference, a metaphor to its great power to deliver his people. Now, in the not too distant future, Israel will see Korah and some 250 like-minded rebels be swallowed up when, according to Numbers 16:32, the earth opens its mouth. Now, in that instance, as when the sea swallowed the Egyptians, it's a sign of God's judgment on wickedness, and it's also a deliverance of his people. Deliverance came from the evil influence of Korah, and it had also come from the Egyptians. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. Now, the verbs in this verse and the next are past tense in the Hebrew, even though the thoughts are from the future. Now, John has indicated that he's a little bit rusty on his Hebrew. I have no background in Hebrew, so this is from the lesson commentary. But just imagine speaking about a future action as though it has already happened. Just affirms the certainty of the coming event. God's faithfulness to his promises prompted him to redeem the people of Israel from Egypt. God spoke of it as to Moses as delivering Israel from Egypt. And our redemption mirrors that. We are God's people led out of sin and into a new life. Well, God was taking his people to the promised land. Canaan was a place that God had chosen as his holy dwelling. The tabernacle is going to be traveling with them as they travel through the wilderness as a symbol of God's presence, as was the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire by night. And when they settle into the land, God will allow Solomon to build a temple in Jerusalem as a permanent reminder that God chose to dwell with his people. Now, if we were to spend more time reflecting on and emulating God's holiness, would our life change? And whatever your answer to that question is, it's going to depend in part on how well you are already doing that, as we allow the holiness of God to influence us. Well, the next verses talk about the nation's fear. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as a stone. Until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you brought pass by. Now, the emphasis changes on what God was doing for the people as to how the other people are going to react, how they're going to respond when they hear about the mighty power and the mighty acts. Anguish maybe reflects the magnitude and the acuteness of the pain and fear of the people of Philistia. The land of Edom, southeast of the Dead Sea, trace their lineage to Esau. Moab lay to the east of the Dead Sea, and Genesis traces the parentage to Lot by his oldest daughter. Well, as the Israelites end up 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they were instructed not to provoke either Moab or Edom because God had given them an inheritance as well. Jericho, located in Canaan, prime example of the consuming terror the people felt. 40 years after singing his songs, Joshua sent 2 spies to the city of Jericho. Rahab, a Canaanite woman herself, reported how terrified the people were because of how Israel crossed the Red Sea. Again, there's a metaphor, this time regarding God's arm, which celebrated the power of the Lord in working on behalf of his chosen people. Well, there's promises for Israel. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. And once again, Moses is speaking of God settling the people in their promised land, specifically to the mountain of Zion. And the sanctuary refers specifically to the future temple that would be built on Zion. The Lord reigns forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Chariots had been introduced into Egypt as instruments of war by the Hyksos, who ruled Egypt for a time. Early on, the chariots had been used largely for ceremonial purposes. I don't think it took too long until the Egyptians discovered how their military usefulness and added many chariots to their armies. Now remember, as they're chasing after the Israelites, the water parts. Israel goes through on dry ground. They're being chased by the Egyptians, all these chariots. Now, you would think, what are chariots pulled by? Well, by horses. They can move pretty fast. How quickly would they be able to cross and to catch up with the Israelites? Remember, the pillar of cloud had slowed things down for them, gave Israel a head start crossing the Red Sea. And then things started happening to the chariots. Wheels started falling off. Now, how fast can you drive a chariot if the wheels are broken? Both Egypt and the Israelites reached the depth of the ocean. For Israel, the depth of the ocean was dry ground as they crossed. For Egypt, the depth of the ocean as the waters covered them. Observers of the human condition sometimes declares laws that describe the human condition. For example, Murphy's Law states that if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. There's 2 laws regarding mechanical repair. You can check this with Johnny Hutchinson maybe. The first for the repairman says, after your hands become coated with grease, your nose will itch. And this is for every one of us who has a vehicle. It's for car owners. When the repairman tries to find the malfunction, the car will run perfectly. I've been in that situation. There's this recurring problem. You take the car in, nothing. They can't find out what's wrong with it. Then there's a law of unintended consequences. Yeah. We think this is what, we're doing this for a purpose. Well, sometimes other things happen besides, our original goal. Pharaoh found, after he'd yielded to God after the 10th plague, changed his mind, sent his army to try to recapture them. Pharaoh's army died in the process of discovering the unintended consequence of rebellion against God. Numbers 32:23 states the law of unintended consequences another way. Be sure that your sin will find you out. Next part of the song, Miriam's example. We're up to verse 20. Then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Now, Miriam and both of her brothers were designated as prophets, and in this verse, there's a feminine ending to the word prophet. There's one of several women in the Bible who were designated as prophets, prophetess. Now, this is the first time Miriam was mentioned by name. Moses identified her as a sister to Aaron. We see Miriam as the older sister of Moses, whose task was to watch over that basket that had been placed on the banks of the Nile to see what happened to Moses. Well, Moses and all the women used their timbrels, which are small drums, something that had earlier been lost on me. I hadn't realized that. And rhythmic dance to provide accompaniment to the song of Moses. My son Josh, the missionary, tells about in worship service that sometimes the Maasai elders will get on the young men a little bit when their jumping is not enthusiastic enough. There's jumping. I guess we could see that as a type of praise dance. And for the Maasai, it is done as part of their praise and worship to God. Next week is going to be more about worship with dance, and you can imagine who the main figure is in that one. If not, you could go to your, if you have one, and find out who it is. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both the horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." Now, Miriam is the person who is leading the women, and it may be an antiphonal type of an approach where one group answers another. Our song, "I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised." One group sings phrase, another group sings the same phrase, and it just the song continues that way. The words, powerful reminder as to what God has done. And the most powerful nation at the time was no match for the God of Israel. There was a student at a Bible college who come from a specific tradition of worship, had no experience whatsoever with the idea of worship with contemporary music. And he was given an assignment to visit several different congregations that used, the traditional, use the contemporary, and analyze it a little bit. Well, he came up with what he saw as a primary difference between traditional and contemporary worship. With the traditional worship service primarily extolling who God is and what he has done, and the contemporary worship service focusing on expressions of adoration for God. Miriam, those who sang with her exulted in both, expressing their feelings to God, about God, and proclaiming what he had done for them. Both elements were involved. Our songs come with context. The story behind Amazing Grace. Just add depths to the lyrics. Long history in England and especially in North America probably shape how we hear and sing it today, what it means to us. Like the song that Moses, Miriam, and the people sang, our songs come from specific situations, maybe of deliverance, of healing, a crossing from death into life. So let's be challenged to do as the psalmist states in Psalm 98:1. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things today. Now, as you reflect upon your life, as you reflect upon your experience in church, as you reflect upon your experience in the community you live in this week, what song will you sing as a result of God's work in your life? Walking around the neighborhood, sometimes it's a time of meditation. Sometimes there's a time of just looking at what God has created, the beauty of it. Sometimes just reflecting upon what God has done for me. And sometimes there's certain phrases of some of the songs that I guess I could say I sing them, just not out loud. I'm singing them in my mind. When I do that, the pitch tends to be just a little bit better. So the thought to remember, God always wins. We want to align ourselves with him. This week, take time and just allow reflection, allow worship to occur, praise to occur in you, whether it's out loud or it's just in your mind. Let's close with prayer. Almighty God, as we face trials this week, we commit ourselves to remember that in you we have victory. In Jesus' victorious name, we thank you. And we say amen. Good message this morning, John.
Thank you, God.
Good worship, folks.
Thank you.
All right. Did someone come in during the services?
I don't think so.
Okay. I thought I heard.
These are several people dropping off.
Just dropping off. Yeah, I thought I saw through the crack like the door opened.